Good morning to you. One thing we know is that the voters notice and deeply dislike accusations of shady, disreputable behaviour by MPs, what these days the headline writers simply call sleaze. They hated it during the final period of John Major's government. They hated it when the MP's expenses scandal broke under Gordon Brown, and initial polling suggests they don't much like it when they read about Boris Johnson's botched attempt to change the rules and save one of his MPs. Sir John Major has accused the current Prime Minister's government of being politically corrupt. No love lost there, of course. So, is this a truly dangerous moment for Boris Johnson, or just another quickly forgotten flurry of negative headlines? This morning, we will try to find out. I'm joined live in the studio by one man who really hopes the mud sticks, the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. Responding for the government by the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. And to give us her assessment of just where we are on the COVID pandemic this winter by Dr. Susan Hopkins from the UK Health Security Agency. Oh, and a man who knows all about bending the rules, the tycoon Logan Roy from Succession, in the shape of actor Brian Cox, whose new memoir covers his fine career of stage and screen and his current support for Scottish nationalism. Reviewing the news this morning, two political journalists who've been at the heart of this story, Katy Balls from The Spectator and Laura Hughes from the Financial Times. But first, the news with Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The Prime Minister is urging countries at the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow to pull together and drive for the line as the conference enters its second and final week. Boris Johnson said bold compromises and ambitious commitments were needed to tackle climate change ahead of what are expected to be increasingly intense negotiations at the summit. Police in Texas have opened a criminal investigation after 8 people died at a music festival on Friday. Dozens more were injured in the crowd surge on the opening night of Astro World, which had been organised by the rapper Travis Scott. The dress which the singer Amy Winehouse wore for her final performance is set to fetch around £14,000 at an auction today. The singer wore the dress at a concert in Belgrade a month before she died in 2011. Some more of the Grammy Award winners' belongings will also go under the hammer, with all proceeds going to the charity set up in her name. And Norwich City have won their first Premier League match of the season, but the smile was wiped from manager Daniel Farke's face just hours later after he was sacked with his side bottom of the table. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Very many thanks for that. And now, as you would expect, to the front pages. And the Sunday Times has a new angle on the so-called sleaze story. New Tory sleaze row as donors who pay £3 million get seats in the Lords. They've looked back at who's got seats in the Lords and what they did before. And the short answer is be Tory party treasurer and give the Tory party £3 million and you will get a seat in the House of Lords. We'll talk about that, of course, in a moment. The Observer, Johnson's sleaze crisis deepens amid pressure on COVID deals. The Sunday Telegraph is looking forward to what's going to be the next big political story, I think, which is the row between the EU and Britain over the Northern Ireland border. UK to ditch £15 billion deal if Brussels goes hostile. There's a general thought that Brussels is going to go very hostile if this happens. And finally, the Mail on Sunday, different like no booster, no hassle-free foreign travel. The government tightening up on boosters, a big problem for the government and for the country about the take-up of COVID boosters at the moment. To review those papers, Katy Balls and Laura Hughes. Welcome to you both. Laura, I was mentioning the Sunday Times story there. It's more a kind of collation and analysis of information rather than absolutely hard new facts, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we knew that there was a pattern of the government handing out peerages to those who have given the governing party a lot of money, and obviously it's been the Tories for a number of years, and so we've seen a number of party treasurers finding themselves in the House of Lords. And the point this piece makes as well is that there's correlation between the amount of money that was given, but also a lot of these ex-treasurers don't seem to be making huge contributions.
They don't speak much,
to
do
the
they?
House of Lords. And that's the whole point. They're meant to be put in there because of their business, political experience, their nous, and clearly that might not be the case.
There have been rumblings about who gets into the House of Lords forever. I mean, you know, Lloyd George after the First World War and Maundy Gregory and corruption and so forth. It's been a story that goes on, and yet nothing ever seems to change.
No, and, well, when you have the governing party in a position to offer out perks like this to loyal donors, you can understand why they might not want to change the rules, because they're getting lots of money and that's supporting their political objectives. So perhaps that's why it hasn't changed. But in the light of what has happened this week, it's a sort of another example. Now,
Laura, I said right at the beginning of the show the Tories noticed this kind of thing. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, it's mixed. So that the Observer have a poll that do show the PM's ratings at an all-time low. But overall, the Conservatives are still polling as the most popular party, despite
after all this,
everything that's happened. But, you know, I do, you know, just from talking to people, I think the last week has actually cut through. And it was a really techie, complicated story at the beginning, and then it became really simple. It became about Tory sleaze and the party in power changing the rules at the last minute to save one of their own. And that did make a difference. But who knows, the polls don't suggest it's made a massive difference.
Katy, if it cuts through, if it causes problems for the Prime Minister long term, it's probably partly about how Tory MPs themselves regard all of this. Is there any evidence that they are as angry as some of the papers have been reporting the last couple of days?
Yeah, I think there is evidence. I think it's been an awful week for the Prime Minister, and I think where we're going to see it most immediately is in terms of the mood in the Parliamentary Party. You have Tory MPs quite spooked by the mail they've been getting, going into their inboxes. They say it's not quite Barnard Castle levels of anger, but it's pretty close compared to
emails and
scandals.
letters, not the Daily Mail.
Yes.
That too.
Yeah, all coming through. And then I think that what we're hearing and what you can see in some of the papers, such as this item in Anna Mikhailova's diary in the Mail on Sunday, is how difficult is party management going to get. She quotes a message from Philip Davies, who I think has always
Tory
been seen
MP,
as
but quite on the right of the party.
Yeah, and quite independent-minded. But he makes the point, you know, that he voted with the government, wasn't particularly happy about doing so, but then the party overturned that decision and said it made him look like a fool, so good luck with any free line whips in the future.
He's simply saying, I'm not going to do what you tell me in the future. That's quite a moment.
Exactly, and even though I think Philip Davies is seen as more independent-minded, it's something I'm picking up from MPs too, in the sense that the few Tory MPs who've come out with, well, probably is a stretch, but, you know, okay this week, are those who ultimately rebelled, ignored the government. In the case, for example, of Angela Richardson, lost her job as a PPS, then was reinstated, is not really sending a message, even to those on the payroll, that you should be listening to what the government is saying if they can't even guarantee they're going to go forward with that.
And Laura, there seems to be an interesting division in attitude between, as it were, the old-time so-called Spartans, the Brexiteer MPs who in many ways thought that they were in control of the Parliamentary Party, and those new Conservative MPs from the so-called Red Wall seats in the North and the Midlands who've come in and have a slightly different view. Yeah. The Mail's got an interesting piece on that. Exactly,
and the Spartans who very much were at the forefront of the Brexit movement actually claimed a huge amount of success on that front and were seen as sort of the old guard.
They rallied round Owen Paterson, didn't they?
You could physically see them rally round their friend Owen Paterson in the House of Commons, and I think the Prime Minister does listen to them because they were right on Brexit. They did have a success there in terms of, you know, what the public wanted, but this has massively backfired. You've got a much younger intake who have come from these seats that used to be Labour, who are seeing how this is playing out on the front pages and, like Katy said, are going back to the whips and potentially they might refuse the government order in the future. They're going to have to go with their own gut instinct because their voters are watching them.
So, Katy, where does the Cabinet sit in all of this? Because you would have thought the Cabinet would be the kind of fail-safe mechanism that would stop the government getting into these kind of troubles in the first place.
I think the absence, looking at the papers when it comes to where are the Cabinet, you have a few anonymous, angry briefings, but I think it just points to the fact that part of the reason this has caused such a stink this week for Boris Johnson is it is touching on previous worries that ultimately Number 10 do not consult really anyone outside Number 10. Some people in Number 10 perhaps aren't even consulted. And the Cabinet just aren't brought in on big decisions. And I think the fact that Jacob Rees-Mogg, Mark Spencer, the Chief Whip, are the two who seem to be leading this doomed plot to spare Owen Paterson's suspension, the fact that you don't really have the other players in Cabinet really even in that conversation putting a call into the Prime Minister and saying, change course, this is a mistake, I think does just show you that slowly but surely they've been cut more and more out decisions. And it's been a cause of unease for some time, but things like this really, light it up again.
And John Major said there was an element of bullying. Now, we know that John Major doesn't like this government, that's no news. But you had an extraordinary line in your story, Laura, about a Tory MP who was told, either by the whips or by the Prime Minister, that if he didn't fall into line on this very, very controversial vote, his constituency might lose money.
Well, yeah, and we spoke to a number of MPs who are currently asking the government for lots of money for projects in their constituencies, and it was very much implied to them that you want to stay on the government's good side. And I think a lot of MPs took the decision, well, this is going to go through anyway, it'll create a bit of a stink, I might as well get some money out of it. And a lot of them felt, I need to stay on the government's good side, and I've got to pick my battles.
That's quite a threat. Let's move on to another big story for the whole country at the moment, Katie, which is COVID still. People are very confused about where we exactly are. There seems to be a general feeling that the booster vaccine programme is not going nearly as well as the first part of the vaccine programme. The rollout was lauded around the world and certainly here in Britain. This time round it's different.
Yes, and the Telegraph have an interesting story, which is, boosters need injection of urgency after deaths of double-jabbed over 70s. And the piece is pointing to statistics from the government's own reports, but also the fact that if you compare our booster programme to places like Israel, could these lives have actually, been saved? Are they needless deaths because we have been slower this time around? And I think when you look at that booster programme, there's lots of questions about why is it different than the original vaccine rollout?
What's going wrong?
Is it because we're, back then, there's a real national effort, people are just, bit switched off? Or is it the fact that we've had some big, personnel changes, you've had people moving around, we have a new vaccines minister, you've had the Number 10, you had the person who was in charge of the vaccines on the civil service side moved to Number 10 to focus on domestic policy, only to then be brought back in the sign that they really were quite worried that this is falling behind.
So organisational mess-ups is part of the story.
And potentially people feel as though life is a bit more normal, so there isn't that urgency.
There's no longer the
before,
fear factor.
Exactly, whereas I think before people thought, right, life can return to normal if I get double vaccinated, and that's slightly gone because people are out and about as normal.
And there's an interesting story, isn't there, about people in care homes who have chosen not to be vaccinated, now moving into the NHS.
Yeah, and 1 in 10, which I was quite surprised about. And the rules change on Thursday, so you'll have lots of workers still refusing to get vaccinated, and the fear is that they'll just move into the hospitals and that they'll stay within the NHS and they'll just go where they're allowed to. And of course that's completely counterintuitive, because the whole point about vaccinating care home staff is that you protect the elderly. So sending them into places where people are vulnerable and ill, it seems a bit of a mismatch there, and it could be a huge problem.
Okay. So we have talked about the two most important stories this morning. We haven't had time to get to the 1,376 other interesting stories in today's newspaper. Always, we say, buy your newspapers, and so to the weather. I'm one of those who no longer gets excited by fireworks, but I have been excited by some of the most glorious, bright November days in many, many years. At its best, this can be the most beautiful season of the year. More clear skies, please. Over to Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt, doesn't look very clear.
I do have some brighter skies, Andrew, for you, but it can be the most interesting part of the year as well. Rather rough conditions at the moment out to the north and west of Scotland. This is Troia Beach on the Isle of Harris, and it's across Scotland where we've got some very lively winds at the moment, gusts 40 to 60 miles an hour, and some pretty rough seas set to push in towards Sutherland coast with waves maybe in excess of 10 metres in height. But it is going to be a day that quietens down. Fewer showers later on across northern Scotland, only 1 or 2 showers in the west. Most of you getting away with a dry Sunday, and you will get some of those clear skies, Andrew. There will be a little bit of sunshine at times too, although the cloud will always remain fairly dominant to the south and the west. Now, winds are easing down compared to what we've got this morning, but it'll still be a noticeable breeze this afternoon, making it feel cool out the sunshine, but 9 to 13 Celsius, that's around the mid-November average. Now, as we go through Sunday and into Monday, with lighter winds, clearer skies, Scotland, England and eastern Wales. Rural parts and the suburbs could be prone to a bit of frost for tomorrow morning's commute, but in the west, next weather system working its way in, cloud, patchy rain or drizzle to start the morning and temperatures on the rise. But it will be a chilly start to tomorrow morning across central and eastern areas with that frost around, best of the sunshine in the morning, but rain spreading across Northern Ireland quickly and through the late morning into the afternoon through Scotland, northwest England, north and west Wales, staying driest towards the south and the east with some sunny spells just about holding on. And it's slowly getting a little bit milder again, but none of that sunshine, Andrew. Back to you.
All right, many thanks nonetheless. Now, as we were hearing, many Tory MPs this weekend are pretty hacked off that they were pressurised into voting for a new disciplinary regime, which then, under pressure, Number 10 promptly abandoned. Many others simply feel the whole affair was handled incompetently. So what is the case for the defence? I'm joined from Glasgow, where he's at the Climate Change Conference, by George Eustice, the Environment Secretary. Mr Eustice, welcome. Can I start by asking you, do you accept that Owen Paterson was wrong to use his position as an MP to lobby on behalf of paying clients?
Well, look, the report that was produced on this, did say that he crossed that boundary. I mean, it's a difficult situation because obviously MPs have interests, that's fine, and they can declare them and they can still go about their business of raising issues. And having knowledge about something and raising it isn't something that should be frowned on. But yes, this report did conclude that he overstepped that mark.
Yes, the Standards Committee itself says this is an egregious case of paid advocacy. He has repeatedly failed to perceive his conflict of interest and used his privileged position as a Member of Parliament to secure benefits for two companies for whom he was a paid consultant. And you agree that was wrong. Can I ask you, when you voted to pause Owen Paterson's suspension from the House of Commons, did you know that he had behaved wrongly?
I was aware of the contents of that report, yes, but I think the issue really was actually not about Owen Paterson. It was, should there be an appeals process? And I think what Owen Paterson's case had raised, and he'd made this point, that he didn't really have a chance to defend himself, to explain things. There wasn't an appeals process. I think it's generally felt that in most walks of life, when you have these kinds of disciplinary processes, it's important as well that you have an appeals process. That's what the vote was about. But look, in the end, you can only take that forward with...
Can I just jump in on that? Because you've just said that you voted against a system which had found Owen Paterson rightly guilty of breaching the rules of the House of Commons, and yet you voted to change that system. And I think a lot of people were saying, why? What's going on in this guy's head?
No, we didn't. So the vote wasn't to reject. It was open to Parliament to do that, but the vote wasn't to reject the report that had been put together. The vote was to establish an appeals process so that MPs in the sort of position that, yes, Owen Paterson was in, but others as well in future, would have a right of appeal. And I think that's right. It's still an important objective to have due process here, to have a right of appeal. But obviously we can only take that forward with the agreement and cooperation of other parties. So at the moment, the opposition have said they're not willing to engage in a discussion about such a process. So that's why we withdrew the motion that was put forward.
So you are sticking by the government's original decision to change and upend the current system, and it's only because of the opposition that you've had to do the U-turn. So you, as it were, you're defending the position before the U-turn.
Yes, and we've been consistent on this throughout. We think there's a case for an appeals system. The vote that took place last week was actually about establishing an appeals system. It wasn't about even rejecting the report into Owen Paterson. The opposition parties subsequently made clear that they weren't willing to have a discussion on that, so it was withdrawn. I think it's fairly straightforward.
Because the Conservative chair would have had the casting vote on that new system. That was the problem. Sir John Major, not a close friend of yours, I understand that, has said that this is corrupt and came directly from the Prime Minister. Did it come directly from the Prime Minister?
Look, I wasn't involved in the decisions in Number 10 on this. So the truth is, I suspect that on an issue as important as this, there would have been a discussion between Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House, and obviously also the Chief Whip and the Prime Minister and other advisors. That's how these sorts of decisions are made.
But surely on a thing as important as this, the crucial missing element in all of this is the Cabinet itself. The Cabinet is supposed to be there for big decisions where you sit around and you decide what's the right thing to do. Was there a Cabinet discussion on this?
Well, there wasn't a meeting of full Cabinet to discuss this. But that's often, this is like a decision on how to vote on a particular motion. It would be normal in such cases for that to be taken by the ministers with a relevant involvement, or in this case, of course, the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Chief Whip and the Prime Minister himself. That's how decisions of that sort would be made. And we have Cabinet, subcommittee structures on policies, as you know, and that's where a lot of things get decided.
Going back to this particular vote, 19 MPs who had been reprimanded by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone, and 3 MPs currently being investigated by her, voted to weaken her power. Why do you think that was?
Well, obviously, if you're talking about the amendment that we put forward, yes. People were voting to establish an appeals process, and it may well be that
weakened the case against weakened the power of the person who was investigating them. That's my point. Well,
I don't think it's. I think it's very defensive for people to say that having due process, having an appeals process, weakens the authority of the original person that carries out the investigation. I don't see that. We don't say that in any other walk of life. If you were to have an unfair dismissal on you, Andrew, you'd have a right of appeal in some way. It doesn't undermine the authority of anyone.
One of your colleagues went on national television to suggest that Catherine Stone should be considering her position. In other words, was on the way out. Was that a fair and decent way to treat a public servant who was doing her job?
Well, look, what we were actually trying to do here is to establish an appeals process. So it's totally separate from that. And so, of course, you'd have the investigator in this, the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards, who would carry out an investigation. But we do think there's a case for an appeal. It's obviously not going to be brought forward now without the support of the opposition parties.
Let me just hover over Catherine Stone herself. This is a public servant who is doing her job according to the rule book, so far as anyone can tell. Your colleague, the business secretary, said that she should reconsider her position as a result of all of this. We know that she has received an enormous amount of hate mail, and it's reported that she is getting police protection. I just ask you again, is that a decent and proper way to treat a public servant?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying about what the business secretary said. Our view is that there was a panel that looked at this, and obviously she makes recommendations that then go to a panel of MPs themselves to consider. There is a case for there to be an appeal process in that, since many people that have been subject to this process don't feel that they have a chance to give their account. That's what we were trying to do, is achieve an appeals process.
Well, there's another aspect to this that's been much talked about in the press and indeed in Parliament. Let me read you what Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, has tweeted. It's no coincidence, she says, that Boris Johnson has been attacking and undermining the independent anti-sleaze watchdog when he is facing another investigation into breaking the rules over the financing of his number 10 flat. Do you accept that Catherine Stone has the power to investigate the Prime Minister over that matter?
Well, look, she has the power to investigate members of Parliament on how these things go. The matter referred to about the refurbishment of number 10, that's obviously a story some months ago now. There was a review that looked at this. Lord Geit, I think, took a view on this, looked at it, concluded that the Prime Minister had acted, fully within the ministerial code. So I think that issue was looked at, was investigated, and was very much put to bed, and there was nothing to say.
It was a different kind of investigation. This looks at the behaviour of MPs as MPs. Now, if there is nothing to hide here, if it's all above board, why don't you simply say, yes, of course, Catherine Stone, come in and investigate this, and we will give you all the help you need. Clear it up.
Well, I mean, it's not her role, I don't think, to implement the ministerial code. It's very much around parliamentary standards and MPs. And of course, not every...
No, I said the parliamentary code, which is different, and she does have the power over that.
Yes, well, I mean, if she thinks of some grounds under some parliamentary code to do something. But I think the point is, number 10...
So you can welcome an investigation?
No, I'm saying it's been investigated already. We have a ministerial code that's about how ministers conduct themselves, and there's been an investigation based on that. And there are civil servances and processes within the civil service to ensure that there's propriety in ministerial office. And if it relates to refurbishment of the number 10 flat, that's clearly a ministerial issue, not a members of parliament issue.
Well, he is, of course, both of those things. But let me ask you about the front page.
Well, not every member of parliament lives in number 10.
That's also true.
Only prime ministers do, and that's why it's right that it's covered by the ministerial code.
Let me turn to the front page of the Sunday Times this morning. In the past 20 years, all 16 of the Conservative Party's main treasurers, apart from the most recent, have been offered a seat in the House of Lords. Do you understand why many people will look at that and say this is a sleazy government?
I don't, actually. These people will be philanthropists in every case.
They're philanthropists who've given £3 million on average each to the Conservative Party. They're not ordinary philanthropists, they're Conservative Party supporting philanthropists.
Well, they're philanthropists who give huge amounts to charity, who would be very successful in business, and therefore on those grounds ought to be considered for the Lords. And in addition, the fact that they have been engaged with political parties, whether that's Labour or Conservative Party. People like that have an interest in politics. They are philanthropists. They've made a great contribution to public life. And in many cases, they've got a lot of expertise in business that is valuable to the House of Lords.
Let's turn to where you are now, which is the Climate Change Conference. Now, you have suggested there should be a tax on carbon-intensive food, in other words, meat. When are we going to see a meat tax introduced?
We're not going to bring in a meat tax. I mean, the context of the discussion on this and what I actually said is for the next 7 years, we have a big programme to repurpose the agriculture budget that we have. And so there is no case for any kind of carbon emissions trading or meat tax or any such thing in the food sector. However, beyond that, were you to introduce some kind of emissions trading scheme to try to reduce carbon emissions further and develop private finance in this area, then you would also need to have some kind of carbon border tax to take account of those countries that maybe weren't pulling their weight.
Sorry.
So we're not going to have an arbitrary meat tax or meat levy. That's never been on the cards. I've never supported it.
OK, so I understand that, but you just talked about a border tax. Are you saying that countries which don't meet their obligations on climate change, we would tax either food or indeed other products, there might be mobile phones or whatever, coming into this country to take account of the fact that they were not doing what we thought they should do?
That's right. That would be the logic of the approach. And it's widely recognised that an emissions trading scheme in carbon and carbon credits can't really work unless you have some kind of carbon border tax. Now, this will take time to do. The Treasury and my colleagues in BEIS are sort of considering models in this space. In an ideal world, it would be done multilaterally with the whole world coming together to agree this. But it is going to be important if you're going to have carbon taxes at some point in the future and emissions trading. You can only really make sense of that with a carbon border tax.
So this is really interesting. In effect, we would be saying to countries like China and India, if you don't do what's needed, then we will start to tax your products more highly.
Well, I'd put it a different way. It's we would be saying as countries that we're taking the action necessary to deal with this global challenge, but we're not going to allow those producers in this country to be undercut by those who aren't doing their share. And we're not going to export pollution. So if you don't want to export pollution, then you do at some point have to consider something like a carbon border tax. Ideally, it would be done multilaterally with agreement around the world. We're a long way from being able to do something like this, but it would be necessary if you were to move to an emissions trading type system.
George Eustice, thanks very much. Very interesting. Thank you. Now then, just over 2 weeks ago, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, warned that COVID cases could go as high as 100,000 a day. But instead of increasing, they've been dropping. Yesterday, just over 30,000 cases were recorded. Deaths have remained stubbornly high, though. Dr. Susan Hopkins is the Chief Medical Advisor to the newly formed UK Health Security Agency. Now, the Health Secretary says that if we're going to get through smoothly to Christmas, we need to speed up the booster vaccine programme quite sharply. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that the vaccines, particularly boosting in the over 50s and the vulnerable, will help protect hospitals and reduce the number of individuals requiring hospital admission and also dying.
So what's been going wrong with the booster rollout?
So I think, firstly, it's been quite good. There's over 60% of the population that are being offered boosters are taking it up. I think it's slower than we saw in the first round. I think that may be due to people thinking they're already protected, which is why we're giving a lot of public health messages about why it's so important for them to come forward for their third dose. It's also been made easier to get that third dose as close to 6 months as possible by releasing the vaccinations just after 5 months.
And getting through a smooth winter depends upon this going right now.
I believe so. I think that we are seeing immune waning effects from the vaccine. We know that the virus is circulating at very high levels in our community. So unless people get vaccinated, we will have a long and difficult winter.
As I was just suggesting just now, of course, the number of cases is no longer rising. It's plateauing. It may be going down. I don't know whether you think we're over the hump or not, but certainly the deaths are high.
Yeah, well, firstly, I mean, our peak number of new cases diagnosed was on the 18th of October, with nearly 58,000 people diagnosed on that day in the UK. And from my point of view, we see about a 10-day to 2-week lag for hospital admissions, and you can see that's flattened off in the last week.
That suggests we are past the peak.
But that means we're at the sort of flattening at the peak, and then deaths always lag by another week or two, because that's always the last thing that happens in seeing it. Of course, we may be over this peak, but we could stay at a very, very high level like this, which will mean we have deaths that could be prevented by vaccination.
So a slightly grim sounding but very important question, who is dying?
So the people who are dying are the same people who have died all the way through. So it is particularly the older age groups, so the over 70s in particular, but also those who are clinically vulnerable, extremely vulnerable, and have underlying medical conditions.
So I find this quite confusing because they're also the people who've been most likely to be vaccinated, and indeed double vaccinated. We have very high levels of double vaccination among the elderly and most vulnerable. So how come there's still a large number of deaths in that group?
Well, as we've mentioned, the immune effects wane, and what we see is that especially in the older or the vulnerable groups, those are the people whose immunity will wane the most. So if you're a healthy 30-year-old, then 2 doses will protect you for a longer period. And that's why those people need to come forward for their third dose as soon as possible.
So back to the booster programme, are the people who are dying vaccinated or unvaccinated?
So we're still seeing deaths mainly in the unvaccinated population, so even a very small number of unvaccinated, and there's still about 5% of that older age group who remain unvaccinated. But increasingly, because of immune waning effects, there are deaths in the vaccinated group as well.
There was some other good news this week, of course. 2 new treatments, pill-based treatments are coming in. Are those a game changer, do you think, to cut the death rate?
So I think the first drug has just been licensed, molnupiravir, by MHRA last week, and that is great news, and it will start to be rolled out through a drug trial in the end of this month, beginning of December. As we don't understand how this drug will work as effectively in the vaccinated population, so this drug was actually, all the trials were done in the pre-vaccinated, and that will help us understand it at scale in the population. The new Pfizer drug is probably not going to be licensed until the new year sometime. It's very good news that they've closed their trial early because of such large effects, but it's still likely to be a couple of months away.
All right. I suppose the thing hanging over all of this is the possibility of yet another variation, yet another kink and change in the virus. Are you watching for that, and have you seen any signs of a new variation?
So we're constantly watching the virus, and we're constantly seeing mutations on the virus. That's what we would expect. We are monitoring variations that we think are important, particularly now on top of Delta, because Delta is really what's dominating everywhere. We haven't got one that we're particularly concerned about at the moment. We're not seeing anything make the step change like Alpha or Delta did, which were really hugely more transmissible. But we will need to continue to monitor that over the coming months. And this may be like flu, where we have to have an ongoing monitoring programme and change vaccines in the future.
So is it possible that we're getting to the stage where the virus has, as they say, nowhere else to go?
Well, I think it's very early in our living with this virus to say that, but we've definitely seen large changes in the virus over the last 2 years, and I think the changes are likely to be smaller and more incremental from here on in.
All around us, people are going out doing their Christmas shopping and making plans and going to restaurants, still with masks on, still wondering about social distancing, still nervous. Could this be the last Christmas where we have to think that way?
So I think this, hopefully, will be the last Christmas where we have to think that way. I think that we'll know much more when we get to the spring, and we'll know much more about the virus as time goes on. I do think, though, that this is going to be part of our endemic seasonal influenza and other respiratory viruses, and perhaps we need to learn from this to prevent and reduce deaths from those as well.
Dr. Susan Hopkins, thanks very much indeed for coming in and joining us. Thank you so much. Now then, Brian Cox's career encompasses some of the finest Shakespearean performances of his generation, Tamburlaine in particular, as well as many major movies of the last 3 decades. He was the first actor to play Hannibal Lecter on the big screen, and he's now dominating the small screen in HBO's hit series Succession. As a Lear-like media magnate, Logan Roy, he heads up a totally dysfunctional but horribly compelling family. Brian has just published his autobiography, and I'm going to talk to him in a minute. But first, here's something we found in the BBC archives, which shows him alongside one of his personal heroes.
You've come late to the banner of Scotland. Must I wait further upon you?
The magnates of Scotland in council, in the name of John, our king, now held in duress, are agreed that Sir Andrew of Murray and Sir William Wallace will be leaders of the army.
Well, that already. We must be acknowledged guardians in Custos Regnus.
No, my son. Such arrogance does you no
matters
credit.
not what you call us. We are what common men have made us. And as such, we have addressed the powers of Europe.
Powers of Europe, Jesu.
Aye! In his holy name.
A little touch of Logan Roy there, I felt.
God, where did that come from?
The archives. We have big archives here.
That's 100 years ago.
Absolutely. And Fulton Mackay, one of the very, very many great actors you've worked with over the years, Gielgud and so many others, Leonard Rossiter.
Yeah.
But Fulton Mackay said something, it comes up again and again in your book. He said, it's not about being a star, you have to be an actor, not a star. And just explain to us a little bit about the difference between the two.
Well, it's you know, when you're young, you are hostage to your ambition. You want to do certain things. You want to be somebody, and that's par for the course. But Fulton always used to say, Brian, don't worry about being a star. And this was the important bit. Just say your prayers and be a good actor. And it was the best advice ever, because it meant that I just concentrated on what I had to do, which was be a good actor.
Now, you grew up on the streets of my hometown, Dundee. You had a very, very tough upbringing in many, many ways. You had to fight your way through. Just tell us a little bit about that early period in your life.
Well, my dad died when I was 8, and he had problems. He was a very generous man, very kind man, very thoughtful man, and he invested the money he made during the war, because he had a grocer's shop, so it was quite successful, and he invested it in a business, and he never saw it again. He lost all the money, and then he developed pancreatic cancer, and within 3 weeks of his diagnosis, he passed away without a will or anything. And my poor Marr, she always said to me when I was a boy, she said, "Remember, Brian, charity begins at home." And just the other night, I found this letter from my mother, which is very moving, talking about my dad and the little differences they had. And it was difficult for her, but as a result, she felt guilty, she felt confused, and she had a massive nervous breakdown after my father died.
So to what extent was throwing yourself into acting, as it were, an escape from the problems of family and...
Well, it was always there from when I was a wee boy. My dad used to put me on the coal bunker at the age of 3, and I would do Al Jolson impersonations at New Year, you know, and I always remember the sensation of the people in the room that was what really drove me on to be an actor. It was this sense of community and harmony, and I just thought, wow, this is. I mean, even as a tot, I got it, and then I decided that's what I wanted to pursue.
We're talking about family. Let's talk about the Roy family for a moment. I think the first thing you asked when you were given this possibility was, does he love his children?
Absolutely.
And that was absolutely crucial. Let's just have a little look at a little moment of succession when he's with his daughter, I think, Shiv, we're going to see.
So yes, I fought for you and your brothers, but you will not find a piece of paper that makes you ashamed of me, okay?
Well, the government does have an unbelievable amount of leverage at its disposal, Dad. The law.
Yeah, the law. The law is people, and people is politics. And I can handle the people.
I will come on to politics a little later in the programme directly. But Logan is a man who bends the rules, but always because he wants to help his children, who are a very, very difficult bunch of kids to help.
Yes, they're rather ungrateful.
Very ungrateful. Let me ask you a little bit about the difference between stage acting, because you've done all the big Shakespeare roles, Ibsen and Chekhov and all the rest of it. But on television, it's particularly about the stillness.
Yeah.
So the camera is on you right close up, and sometimes your job is to do almost nothing at all. There's a lovely scene right at the end of the first season when Kendall is betraying you on live television, and you're sitting there watching it happen, and we're wondering what's going on in your mind.
Well, there were several things going on in my mind. It's this smile, this kind of Mona Lisa smile. So on one hand, he's saying, "Oh, well done, boy," and then he's also saying, "Well, isn't it ironic that a half an hour ago I was telling you to be a killer, and now you've gone and killed your father?" So you know, the great thing about television, the great thing about acting in television, the television format, and the genius that is Jesse Armstrong, who's created these amazing scripts, is that less said, soon as mended. It's the internaling of these characters. But it's the same route as playing King Lear or playing...
He's a Lear-like figure, isn't he?
He's very much a Lear-like figure. So there's a sort of archetypal nature of it, but you don't have to declare it as you have to do on a big stage, but that comes from the same centre.
Brian, there's so much we could have talked about in this book, but there's one thing that comes in, the curse of Brian Cox. What's the curse of Brian Cox?
Well, the curse of Brian Cox is... the fact that, you know, well, I played Churchill, for example, and it came out at the wrong time. And of course, when it comes out at the wrong time, the Oscars is a sort of questionable award season, but it's there and it's been there for a long time. But actually, they call it the award season. It's not done on the work of the year. It's done on the work of between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
So everything depends on when you come out.
And everything depends on when you come out.
And you missed it that time and you're a bit hacked off.
I was very hacked off.
Very hacked off. Brian, we'll talk about politics in a moment. For now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Indeed. Now then, Succession, a Sky exclusive, is available on Sky and on Now television on Mondays at 9 p.m. and on demand. The job of being leader of the opposition is a weird one. Yes, you have to try your best to make the political weather, but you're also waiting around endlessly for the moment the government makes a major mistake. Sir Keir Starmer is with me now.
Morning.
Good morning to you, Sir Keir. Let me ask you first of all about the Owen Paterson business. The government has made a mistake. It's admitted it's made a mistake. It's changed course. Surely that should be the end of the matter.
Well, I think that's a bit of an understatement. Owen Paterson was lobbying the government on behalf of a company that was paying him hundreds of thousands of pounds, and he was rightly found guilty of that. That's been outlawed for a very long time. Along comes the Prime Minister. Instead of upholding standards, he orders his MPs to protect his mate and rip up the whole system. Now, that is corrupt, it is contemptible, and it's not a one-off. This Prime Minister has form, he has pattern. There are so many examples. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, was found to have breached the ministerial code. What happened? She stayed. The advisor had to go. The Electoral Commission started looking at the government. What happened? The government's trying to clip its wings. And now there's been this outrageous undermining of Catherine Stone, the independent commissioner, in this very case. It's a pattern of behaviour. And what makes me most angry is the Prime Minister is trashing the reputation of our democracy and our country. And so this is far from a one-off and a U-turn, a bad week for the government. It's a pattern of behaviour by a Prime Minister who doesn't know how to uphold standards in public life.
It's sometimes hard for me to tell, but I think you're genuinely angry here. Thangham Debonair, the Shadow Leader of the House, has said today that Boris Johnson should actually resign over this. Isn't that going too far? Isn't that playing politics? You don't really expect that to happen.
Well, look, Andrew, I am angry because when I see the reputation of our democracy and our country trashed by this Prime Minister, that makes me angry. Successive politicians and Prime Ministers over the years have tried to build up. Standards have always gone up. And this is with the Prime Minister. And John Major made a very strong intervention yesterday.
Who can't stand Boris Johnson? We know that.
But just hear me out on this, because when there were sleaze in the 1990s, John Major rolled up his sleeves and he put in place the Nolan Committee on Standards in Public Life. So he was the Prime Minister who said, I will clear this up. Boris Johnson's the Prime Minister who is leading his troops through the sewer. He's up to his neck in this. The idea... I don't think you or anybody else could, with a straight face, say that this Prime Minister is the man to clean up politics and to have higher standards in public life, because he's in the sewer with his troops.
Are you really seriously suggesting he should stand down now as Prime Minister?
Well, look, I mean, as the opposition, we always want the government to go. But what I am saying is that, unlike... Well, look, I am angry at what he is doing to our... Okay. Look, in Britain... we have high standards, we play by the rules, and we have relatively low levels of corruption. That is known around the world. That is to be cherished. This Prime Minister is tarnishing that.
I just wonder
and I'm angry about that.
I just wonder if that is still true. Let me put to you the case of the former Labour MP, Claudia Webb, who's been convicted of persistently harassing a female member of the public, including threatening to throw acid over her. Is this not a problem, the behaviour of MPs that crosses all parties?
Well, Andrew, I'm glad you brought up that example, because no case exemplifies the difference in approach better than that case. When Claudia Webb was charged, the Labour Party suspended her. When she was then convicted, we didn't argue with the conviction. We expelled her from the Labour Party. We now say she should resign, and we would support a recall petition. So if I was coming on your show to say, oh, the system was rigged, I don't stand by the decision of the judge, then you'd have a point to put to me. I accepted straight away. We have expelled her from the Labour Party. She should stand down, by the way, and if she doesn't, we'll support a recall petition.
Well, let me put a slightly different point to you, but a related point. She is one of 7 Labour MPs, or former Labour MPs, who've been handed a jail sentence, suspended or otherwise, in the last 10 years. Do you not think you have to look more carefully at how you select candidates in the Labour Party?
Well, we've got a new programme now for selecting candidates for the future, which I think will be a very, very good programme. But, Andrew, the fundamental difference here is between a Prime Minister who, when one of his MPs does wrong, protects his own, protects his mates, and undermines or rips up the system, or me, who says the standards matter. And if there's a finding against one of my MPs, we stand by it, we take strong action, and we've expelled Claudia Webb. There's not much more I can do. I've also said she should stand down.
The question is, in a sense, whether the opposition is going so far against the Prime Minister, you're in some sense slandering him. Let me read you again what your deputy, Angela Rayner... I'm always reading you Angela Rayner quotes. I'm going to read you another Angela Rayner quote. It's no coincidence, she says, that Boris Johnson's been attacking and undermining the independent anti-sleaze watchdog when he is facing another investigation into breaking the rules over the financing of his number 10 flat. Is there any evidence for that at all?
Well, I think there is a whiff that the Prime Minister would quite like the scrutiny and the standards to be weakened because they're looking too closely at him.
You're a lawyer. Whiff is not a word that lawyers use, is it?
Well, look, if this is a one-off, then you could view it in a particular way. But this is a Prime Minister with so many examples of him ignoring findings and this... the sense that he's had all of his life, that there's one rule for him and his mates and another rule for everybody else, is still there at the top of government.
In this case, there has been an investigation by Lord Geit which more or less cleared the Prime Minister. And people will think, why have another investigation so soon? Is this not just Keir Starmer playing politics?
Well, look, I think it's very important that these are drawn to the attention of the authorities and they look at them. And, Andrew, when the authorities look at them, I will... abide by whatever decision they come to. And I would not go out and undermine the independent commissioner or any other of the bodies that are charged with making difficult decisions in these cases. That is not the way I do politics.
Well,
that is the major contrast between me and the Prime Minister.
Let's turn to another aspect of this whole business, which is the House of Lords.
Yeah.
You have said in the past that you want the abolition of the House of Lords. You want to replace it. Everyone says that in opposition. Nothing ever happens. After what we've been hearing about today, is the abolition of the House of Lords now an urgent matter for the Labour Party? And it will be big in your manifesto at the next election?
Well, we certainly need change in the House of Lords.
That's not what I'm saying. Do you want to abolish it?
What I've done, Andrew, is I've set up a commission to look at the future of the UK, including the institutions such as the House of Lords. Gordon Brown is leading that.
And
I'll look at
places, you said you were going to abolish the House of Lords. Well, are you not now going to abolish the House
I've said we need to change the House of Lords. I stand by that. I've asked Gordon Brown to look into exactly what those changes should be, and we'll look at them. But you can't... Waking up this morning to see the Sunday Times report of, I think, 15 of the last 16 mega donors and treasurers of the Conservative Party all trooping in as peers to the Lords.
Okay.
Nobody can make the case that we don't need to change.
So let's talk about what needs to happen next to start to clear up the problems over lobbying. You want to ban anyone who holds ministerial office from having a paid consultancy, is that right? But not from having a job in total?
No, I think they should be banned. There's an argument as to how long that should be. Some have argued for 5 years. That's something that I think we need to talk about, the exact period. But yes, there should be that change. You shouldn't be able to come out of being a minister and straight into a consultancy of some sort that draws on what you've been doing as a minister.
Well, let me ask you about Lord Faulkner. I am not saying Lord Faulkner is a lobbyist in any way, but he's your Shadow Attorney General, and he has got a job with a firm called Gibson Dunn. And Gibson Dunn says on its website, the practice group blends traditional lawyering and business skills with the capabilities of a top-flight lobbying firm. Should he be working for that company?
Well, I think it is important to distinguish between the position of those in the House of Commons and those in the House of Lords.
They're allowed to lobby, are they?
No, just hear me out. In the House of Commons, MPs are paid a salary as full-time members of Parliament. In the House of Lords, of course, there's a daily allowance, but nobody receives a salary. So many people in the House of Lords have jobs
if
that...
he was a minister in your government, would he be allowed to keep that job?
He wouldn't be allowed to lobby, and I wouldn't have that, and that would be absolutely right. But I do think that the position of someone in the House of Lords who has not got an income, as we in the House of Commons have, is different.
Your predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, wanted to ban all MPs from having a second job. Are you in favour of that? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I mean, in the Labour Party, on consultations and directorships, etc., we've been saying for many years that they should go. I think Ed Miliband forced a vote on this back in 2015. So consultancies. We went a step further in 2019 to say no second jobs with clear exemptions. And I think everybody can see there's a world of difference between Owen Paterson on basically a retainer of £9,000 a month accessing the government, and someone like Rosanna Allen Khan, one of our MPs.
The doctor.
Well, she works A&E shifts in a local hospital and did so during COVID. And I think most reasonable people would say, well, there's a distinction to be made there. But what we said was, and the principle is right, no consultation has been a long-standing, consultants have been a long-standing position of the Labour Party.
Let me turn to another story which is likely to become very big over the next couple of weeks or so. There is an expectation that the government is going to trigger Article 16 in the ongoing row of the Northern Ireland border. If they do that, and they feel they have no option but to do that, will you back them or not?
Well, let's look at what the argument is all about. The central purpose of the protocol in Northern Ireland that we're arguing about in relation to Article 16 is there to ensure there's no hard border between North and South in Ireland. So it's very important. It's not a trivial issue. The argument is about the protocol that the government themselves negotiated. So they now complain they don't like it, but the Prime Minister negotiated it. Now,
all accurate, all history. I just want to know, will you back the government if it triggers Article 16 or not?
I don't think that triggering Article 16 will resolve the dispute in relation to the protocol in Northern Ireland. That isn't in the interests of the communities in Northern Ireland or businesses in Northern Ireland. What is in their interest is resolving the issues. Now, because of the way the protocol was drafted and because of what the Prime Minister signed, it is perfectly true that there are checks from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. We want to reduce those.
That's not the way forward. You said
no.
That's not the way
what
forward.
I've said, Andrew,
so he's
is
now trying to get rid of them. So I'm just wondering why you wouldn't back him.
What I'm saying is, don't rip up the protocol, because that has that very important central purpose, which is to protect the no border in Northern Ireland. But, you know, a veterinary agreement, there are ways forward that we've suggested would reduce those burdens between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I want to see both sides sitting down and resolving this. There's a little bit of me, Andrew, I'm afraid, that can't help thinking that the Prime Minister is constantly trying to pick a fight on things like this, so that he hopes people don't look elsewhere in the forest, which is things like the Owen Paterson affair.
So let me ask you about Brexit more generally. The OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, predicts that Brexit is going to cost us 4% on growth over time. Are you prepared to renegotiate to try to mitigate that, or do you think that's something we have to accept?
Well, I think, Andrew, we need to make Brexit work. It's all very well saying get Brexit done. We've got to make Brexit work. It's one of the main themes of my conference speech.
So
in order to do that, we have got to deal with some of the gaps and weaknesses in the current arrangements, whether that's services, whether it's
all those companies worried about, you know, border checks and the bureaucracy and the difficulty of trading with the continent at the moment. Would you do something for them?
I would do whatever I could to make it easier for British firms to trade across the world, but particularly with the EU. Now, I'm not talking, but just let me clear.
Okay,
what I'm not talking about is rejoining the EU. What I'm not talking about is ripping up the current agreement and starting again. Nobody wants to be in that place. But are there sensible adjustments that can be made that will improve? Yes, there are. And if that helps British businesses trading, then I think that is a step in the right direction.
I can understand exactly why you think that, but that requires a mass renegotiation of the treaty.
Andrew, the one thing I learned in the last 6 years is that if you're out of the EU, you are constantly going to be talking to and adjusting the arrangements between Britain and the EU. That is the nature of the beast. That is going on at the moment. Would I take steps to try and improve the lot of our businesses? Yes, I would.
So a lot of people looking at this think there is going to be a point at which the opposition says, given everything that's happened, given all the problems over farming and over trade and the frictions and so forth, we do have to go back and look at this in a big way. We do have to negotiate a different kind of arrangement going forward between Britain and the EU. Not rejoining, but a different kind of relationship. Are you ever going to get to that point?
Andrew, no rejoining, no ripping up the current arrangement and starting again. I don't think anybody wants to go through the torture of 4 or 5 years of starting again. As time goes by, of course, we're going to be in discussions with the EU about how we can improve, make Brexit work. Don't just say get Brexit done, make Brexit work.
All right, Keir Starmer, thanks very much indeed for talking to us just now. Now a look at what's coming up at 10:30 on BBC One.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, with over 2,000 of the UK's churches having closed in the last 10 years due to declining funding and attendance, we'll be asking how they can be saved or if they should be sold off.
Comedian Ellie Taylor looks at how celebs and social media are boosting the popularity of crystals.
Radha Bedi visits a Hare Krishna dairy farm in Hertfordshire where cow welfare comes first and foremost.
And singer Seth Lakeman will be here, bringing some folk to your Sunday morning. Join us at 10:30.
Well, I'm back again, delighted. We used to have sofa chats on this programme. We've got one again at last. We've got Keir Starmer and Brian Cox together. And Brian, one of the bits of your book that I didn't mention earlier on is when you do a chapter on politics and you say you were always a great Labour supporter. You spoke at the late John Smith's funeral and a friend of Gordon Brown in the old days, and you moved to the SNP. First of all, just tell us briefly why.
It's Andrew. We really haven't got enough time. It's a long story. And it comes really down to what I thought was a failure of social democracy, particularly around about 2012, 2010. Also, the Iraq War, that affected me. Blair's hubris affected me. And I saw the party going in a certain direction. And I was really very concerned, because I am a socialist. I'm riven. I'm very riven about the party, and I totally agree with Keir on so many things. But my country was traduced for long enough, time and time again. We voted 62% to stay in Europe, and we were ignored. You know, and you know, if you think about the Thatcher years, we were ignored. So Scotland has always been sidelined.
That was a good, pithy reply, Brian. Keir, is there anything you can say to Brian to win him back, do you think?
Well, I hope so, because it is certainly true that we have to do a lot of hard work in Scotland. I think what Brian has said is really the most important thing, which is actually respect and listening to Scotland has to be an essential part of this, not an afterthought, not a secondary consideration. And I think there's space for that. I actually do think there's a lot that we would agree on, and that is a good basis for building the future. But you know, have we got a lot of work to do? Yes, we have.
And the truth is, you can't get to number 10 without Scotland. You need Scottish seats. Is there any kind of new arrangement you can make with the SNP, any kind of conversation that would help you get back via Scotland to number 10? No, Andrew, as I think I've said to you before, there's no basis for a deal before we go into an election nor coming out of an election. Nothing you can do to persuade them. I'm looking at Logan Roy here with a deeply unimpressed you've got a smile back on your face. But so what's your response to that?
Well, it's a hard question. It really is. It's a painful question. You know, I've been caught. You know, I look at what happened in the north during the last election. I was devastated by that because I'm a socialist. Principally, I'm a socialist, but also I have to put my country first because I have looked at what's happened to my country and I'm disgusted by what's happened. And the penny only dropped later. I didn't, because I was young, I was ambitious, I was thinking about other things. I wasn't thinking about politics. And of course, I was the voice of Labour in 1997. I did all the ads, and I gave myself to it. But in the end of the day, Scotland is prime for me. A lot more work to be done. We've a lot more discussion for us. A lot more discussion. We're out of time. Thanks both very much indeed. That's all from me. And thank you to all my guests today, and of course to you as ever for watching. Until next week, goodbye.